Hello, my name is Chris P. Bacon, and I'm here to expose the United States government for its unethical practice of. Wait, what's this guy doing? He's doing a little thing in the business that we call whistleblowing. Well, what in the world is whistleblowing? Yeah, last I checked, I'm not holding a whistle. No, man, not a literal whistle. Okay, now I'm really confused. Fine, allow me and my friends to explain. First, we're going to go over how what does whistleblowing work. Next, we're going to talk about different ethical views of whistleblowing, such as Kantianism, utilitarianism, and the view from virtue ethics. Then we'll talk about how whistleblowing fits in with the NSPE Code of Ethics. Next, we'll go over how countries feel about whistleblowers, such as Edward Snowden and the United States. I'll give you a few examples of whistleblowers, their background, how they did it, and what their consequences were. Finally, we'll talk about public reaction to whistleblowing.
So, how do whistleblowers come across illegal, fraudulent, and/or immoral activity? Well, in the most common case, the whistleblower is previously a member of an organization committing wrongdoing and has seen evidence of or experienced wrongdoing firsthand. Examples include an individual facing harassment or an employee finding evidence of a company mishandling client information, in some cases selling it. The second case would be a whistleblower illegally accessing a secured system to obtain evidence of wrongdoing. This is generally done by using stolen credentials to access a file system or a communication system, such as an email server or Slack. From there, files and documents are easily accessed and then remotely transferred over to the whistleblower. So how do whistleblowers report illegal, fraudulent, and/or immoral activity? The first way would be internally, where the individual reports illicit activities to higher ups within the organization, such as a supervisor or the human resources department. This would result in the problem staying within the confines of the organization. The individual's identity is most likely kept a secret under company guidelines. For example, in 2004, Joe Darby exposed mistreatment of Iraqi prisoners in Baghdad. He provided evidence to his supervisors and the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command, which then punished the guards that were responsible for mistreatment of the Iraqi prisoners. The second way would be through a private attorney, which is mostly seen in whistleblowing in the private sector. The attorney would help you build your case and make sure you're protected under law. The secrecy of the individual's identity is not always assured. For example, Linda Tripp illegally recorded conversations with Monica Lewinsky, where Lewinsky admitted her relationship with President Clinton. Tripp later gave her footage to an attorney to avoid wiretapping charges. Next would be the press, which is mostly seen in whistleblowing in the public sector. Since releasing sensitive government information is illegal under the contract the employee would sign, the whistleblower would have to resort to anonymously leaking illicit information through the press. The whistleblower risks their identity by working with private journalists. For example, Rick S. Piltz was a former senior associate in the U.S. Climate Change Science Program. He saw firsthand editing of documents by officials to reduce the correlation between human activity and climate change. Upon this, he reported this behavior to the New York Times, who exposed this behavior to the public. Lastly, the whistleblower could use online leak websites such as WikiLeaks. Whistleblowers can access online leak websites and publish leaked documents and files there for anyone to view. Whistleblowers do not directly interact with the media and hold the best chance of being anonymous. For example, in 2010, hundreds of thousands of documents entailing America's involvement in the Iraqi war were published on WikiLeaks, and it was titled the Iraq War Logs. In this series of documents, it was very going It was going very in depth about the horrifics of the war, including civilian murder, torture, and cover-ups.
So today we will be looking at whistleblowing in a utilitarian perspective, and I am Colin Swinsicki. So first, we have to understand utilitarianism. It was created by John Stuart Mill, who was a philosopher. Um, and basically, utilitarianism is an ethical theory that determines what is right and what is wrong. Um, it focuses on the outcomes of decisions. So it's almost like when your parents used to tell you as a kid you want to think about your actions before you do them, because it makes you really think about how will my decisions or actions affect others around me. Um, so you want to be thinking what decision will make the majority of people happy. So in the picture in the top right, you can see a utilitarianism approach on the left side, and on the right side, a non-utilitarianism approach. So as we go down, uh, stakeholders are basically people who you will affect with your actions. It could be family, friends, the company you work for, which is where whistleblowing will tie in, community or society that you live in. So going on, benefits versus harm. The question that you want to ask yourself is how can stakeholders benefit and how can they be harmed by my action? So you want to think about how people will react to the decisions that you make. And the final goal of this is to create the most benefit over harm for the most stakeholders. So you want to have a majority of people benefiting from your actions rather than harming people. And you can see this in the top left under the utilitarianism approach. Every person, every figure has the same amount of money. As on the right side, a non-utilitarianism approach, one person has greater benefit over the other two, which is not a utilitarian approach to the situation. Underneath is just another definition, an easier definition to think about. Utilitarianism is a theory of morality that advocates actions that foster happiness or pleasure and oppose actions that cause happiness, unhappiness, or harm. So you want your actions to deliver the most happiness or pleasure to the majority amount of people. So now looking at whistleblowing, a whistleblower is a person who makes public disclosure of corruption or wrongdoing. Um, uh, Whistleblowing is also very risky because um, if you are releasing information about a company, there's always someone higher up in the company that has more power than you, and so it's risky doing this because the people with power will try and shut you down. Um, and so what we're trying to think about is what is the utilitarian view on whistleblowing? Is it moral? So looking at it from a utilitarian perspective, Mill's utilitarian principle of do no harm. You know, when you're whistleblowing, you're doing this for a reason because the company that you work for is harming other people or other things that shouldn't be harmed. And uh, a whistleblower may think to himself, "Am I going to harm the company?" But from a utilitarian perspective, it's what gives the most pleasure or happiness to the majority amount of people. So you have to think about everyone else in society around yourself when making a decision. We also look at one has the responsibility to hold other people accountable for their actions, and so uh, whistleblowers have to hold other people accountable if they're making decisions that harm society and are not helping bring happiness to the majority amount of people, then they must do something. The duty of a whistleblower is to prevent others from being harmed. And this is really key because the utilitarian principle is do no harm and base your actions on what will give the majority amount of people pleasure or benefit the majority amount of people. And so a whistleblower in a utilitarian perspective is doing the right thing because they are releasing information on illicit activity or illegal activity that is happening in a company that could be harming other people. But them bringing this information out will actually help benefit a majority. Thank you, and that is it.
So now looking at Kantianism and its considerations, going from the ethical responsibility and application, then I'll go into a little bit of the NSPE and the equivalent code of conduct as applied to the specific company that I was looking at in research, and then propose moral conclusion, building off of Kantianism ideologies, and finally the consequences of that moral conclusion on a global, economic, environmental, and social level. So the ethical responsibility and application, the key ethical responsibilities are to follow rules that would hold for everyone and to respect others as people and not use them as objects. If everyone were to whistleblow, there would be a larger inclination to not make any forward movements outside of the movement's legality. Institutions developing or developed would be forced into making sure any growth is done so legally. The pushback to this could be industry growth, like with the pharmaceutical industry, where drugs or medical methods are brought to the market while bypassing many steps for the verification, which would push back production for patients for years. Production to deliver products to patients for years. However, this claim fails because it fails to follow the proper regulations for keeping the public safe by releasing an unchecked medical solution to the public. Contrastingly, whistleblowers have typically faced negative life-affecting consequences by their companies because of their actions. So it would be essential to protect whistleblowers as well as a responsibility. So in Kantianism, it is responsibility for the people to protect and respect others. So by doing so, whistleblowing is needed. It must be valid to whistleblow in this case. And we'll go into a little bit more about that for the moral conclusion. It would make sense to have the conclusion that everyone should report illegal, fraudulent, or concerning activity that affects the public and their safety. However, there are many societal factors that dissuade this course of action. So additionally, when considering the NSPE code of ethics in parallel to Kantianism, a respect is upheld by protecting the potential employee, in this case, a subordinate, actions to negatively impact their livelihood. Additionally, everyone should act accordingly to uphold safety of everyone as expressed in Kantianism, and this is protected in the code of ethics in many companies like the one linked below. So this case, they have for the Forrester Drilling Corporation Code of Ethics, they have a legal action that's in place to protect anyone that is to bring any information that shows wrongdoings in the company, including the step where the employer is investigated to make sure no negative actions were taken on the employee because of their continuation of whistleblowing to protect the safety of others and to put the company in the right path for following morally their ethics, which includes holding the safety of the public paramount. So the moral conclusion, whistleblowing is important to protect the safety of others, and those who do so should do so under protection from negative effects. So this is making sure we have those actions in place, like discussed before, to protect the whistleblower. The consequences is not only within the company, there can be a negative perception of the person whistleblowing, but as long as they're protected legally, it should not affect their course of action and growth within that field, but also public perception. When you look at this is more on the side of the public looking at the company. And so when we have whistleblowing and all these things are coming to show that a company that's doing well has done so illegally, there becomes a perception of not wanting to participate in funding that company or pushing that forward. And that could draw a setback in a product or service that's being brought to the world. And then the global environmental impact, when doing so, a lot of times we're protecting those that are denied their human rights because of these situations that employees or companies are growing their companies. And so that's where we're protecting people on a global level. And then environmental impact, when you're looking at the regulations that are that have been put in place and are growing for waste disposal and energy consumption. This is where, if whistleblowing on a sustainable level is being able to protect those, that's where we'll be able to grow the environment and head in the right direction for the regulations that are being put into place, that have been put into place, that are being put in place, and will be put into place in the near future.
Hi, my name is Michael Rourke, and I will be taking a look at whistleblowing in a virtue theory perspective. Virtue theory is not like any other ethical theory. It relies on trial and error and correcting your mistakes. You don't become virtuous overnight. It takes time and work. There is no rule book in virtue theory like other theories. For example, for Kantianism, you have the category imperative, and with utilitarianism, you have the principle of utility. In virtue theory, we base our decisions off moral exemplars. These are people that you look up to that always seem to know the right thing to do at the right time. Aristotle says we naturally admire these people from their traits that they have developed. Some admirable traits would be courage, honest, bravery, compassionate, unselfish, and loyal. This brings us to Aristotle's golden mean. The golden mean states that for every virtue that there is a balance, kind of like a sweet spot. For example, let's take the virtue integrity. If you have too much integrity, you become a legalist, but if you have too little integrity, you become corrupted. And so the picture in the middle is a quote from Aristotle that I found online. It says that anyone can become angry. This is easy, but to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, this is not easy. So this kind of develops the golden mean, that everything is a balance. And anger is a virtue, and if it's for the right reasons. But if you're too angry, this would be considered a vice. And if you're not angry enough, this is also a vice. So like I said before, nature has built us to desire to be virtuous, Aristotle claims. But nature has also built us to desire vices. But in the long run, vices will lead you to unhappiness. And if you succumb to your vices, you will never reach eudaimonia, as Aristotle claims. Eudaimonia is a state of being happy, healthy, and prosperous. So now let's talk about whistleblowers. Whistleblowing helps reveal dark truths in our government and corrupt corporations. This gives power back to the average person. But of course, after you take power away from somebody very powerful, there's a severe backlash. And it often doesn't end up good for the whistleblower. Hopefully, you were never put in this position. But most conflicts in life depend on details, and there is no cookie cutter way to handle this. But Aristotle believes that a virtuous person is going to make the right choice at the right time in the right way. One example of this would be someone like Edward Snowden. He let the people of the United States know that they were being spied on by the government without their consent. And I feel, me personally, this is a big deal. I think the government is starting to have too much power and control over us, and for this to come out in the light was a very good eye-opener for most people. So he seems to be a very virtuous person. He waited for the right time and was careful not to let anyone innocent get hurt. He took responsibility for his actions, but like I was saying before, when you take power away from someone that is very powerful, like our government, they really don't like that, and he was forced to leave the country or possibly spend the rest of his life in prison. I think someone virtuous would try to stop corruption, but as Aristotle would claim, everything has to be perfect, and through your process of thinking, you have to decide the perfect time and the perfect way to reveal some type of corruption like this Edward Snowden did. These are my thoughts on whistleblowing in a virtue theory perspective. But when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, the most important thing to do is think. And thank you for your time.
Okay, so how do countries treat whistleblowers? Before that, here's a quick recap of what a whistleblower is. A whistleblower is a person, company, employee, or even a government agency that discloses information to the public or higher ups about any wrongdoing. These wrongdoings can range from the form of fraud, corruption, corporate greed, etc. But how do countries treat whistleblowers? Well, in the United States, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSSA, has a whistleblower protection program. This whistleblower protection program enforces provisions of more than 20 whistleblower statutes. Protecting employees from retaliation for reporting violations of workplace safety. The protected activities under the whistleblower protection programs are activities like healthcare, airline, aviation, commercial motor carriers, consumer products, environmental stuff, nuclear stuff, transportation agencies, and etc. The whistleblower laws that the OSHA enforces prohibits employers from retaliating against employers for engaging in activities protected under the whistleblower laws. So what exactly is retaliation? Retaliation occurs when an employer, like a manager, supervisor, or administrator, fires an employee or takes adverse action against an employee while engaging in the protected activity. An example, what is an adverse action? An adverse action is an action that would make an employee not want to or unable to raise concerns about a possible violation or engage in protected activities. Adverse actions may include firing, demoting, denying overtime and benefits, intimidation, harassment, and the changing of hours, and etc. And in the European Union, they also have whistleblower protections, which is called Whistleblower Directive. And the Whistleblower Directive enacts greater protections for whistleblowers by protecting them from retaliation and creating safe channels to report violations. The Whistleblower Directive applies to employees, shareholders, volunteers, facilitators, etc. In order for a whistleblower to be protected under this directive, they must have reasonable evidence that the information they have is true. However, the protection is not lost if the whistleblower has inaccurate information or evidence. Similar to the OSHA's protection, employers cannot retaliate against the employee for reporting information under this directive. So what happens to the whistleblowers? Countries may have whistleblowing protections for our employees, volunteers, shareholders, etc. But the biggest barriers to whistleblowing is the long history of retaliation. One may lose their ability to get employed by other companies or corporations. The risk of whistleblowing is possibly losing one's livelihood because it's much harder for whistleblowers to get a new job because of the history of whistleblowing.
The NSPE Code of Ethics is a panel of engineering ethics experts that have served as the profession's guide through ethical dilemmas. The board consists of 7 licensed members who are appointed by the NSPE president. The fundamental canons of the NSPE Code of Ethics in terms of whistleblowing state that an engineer shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, shall issue a public statement only in an objective and truthful manner, and should avoid deceptive acts. Within the rules of practice, engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. In terms of whistleblowing, this could include the release of information that would have resulted in the harm of safety or health of the public. Such information could be exemplified by the news, such as environmental disasters that could result in the worsening of health conditions or cause mass harm to people. Another example would be whistleblowing of information that a company is causing an increase in non-communicable or communicable diseases that would be detrimental to the health of the public. Engineers shall issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. Engineers are required to be honest and objective in professional reports, statements, and testimonies according to the NSPE Code of Ethics. It is also stated under the Code of Ethics that one should not issue statements, criticisms, or arguments that are inspired or funded by the interested parties unless that party has identified themselves and has been announced that one is only speaking on behalf of the party. Engineers shall act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. In the issue of such, the statement of whistleblowing can be contradicted. Engineers shall not reveal facts or data or information without the prior consent of the client or employer, except as authorized or required by the law or the code. And it would appear that this issue of being faithful to the company can contradict the NSPE Code of Ethics, yet with the large majority of the Code of Ethics holding safety and public knowledge above all else, it would be fair to assume that one could break this part of the Code of Ethics in order to follow the majority of the Code of Ethics. Within the professional obligations, engineers shall be guided in all their relations by the highest standard of honesty and integrity. It is stated that engineers shall acknowledge their errors and shall not distort or alter the facts. This can be applied to whistleblowing because if one were to have altered data, it would be considered immoral. Engineers should advise their employers or clients that when it is believed a project will not be successful. The engineer should not continue with the project as it would be considered immoral. Engineers shall at all times strive to serve the public interest. Engineers shall not complete, sign, or seal plans and or specifications that are not in conformity with applicable engineering standards. If this client or employer insist on such professional conducts, they shall notify their proper authorities and withdraw from further service on the project. There's a direct quote that can relate to whistleblowing in the sense one might be tempted with offers of money or service, but it would be highly immoral to accept, so the engineer should report this information to the public and authorities. Engineers shall avoid all conduct of practice that deceives the public. Engineers shall avoid the use of statements containing a material misrepresentation of fact or omitting a material fact in terms of whistleblowing. If falsified information is presented, one should not do so in accordance with the Code of Ethics. In conclusion, when it comes to the NSPE Code of Ethics, one can assume that it is immoral to misrepresent information to the public and, above all else, hold paramount the safety of the public.
Hey everyone, I'm Jacob Limley, and to dive deeper into whistleblowing, I'll be talking about a case involving Mark Felt, also known as Deep Throat. But first, I'll need to explain the scandal that took place in the White House that led to this whistleblowing. This famous scandal is known as the Watergate scandal. This took place on June 17, 1972, when a robbery took place in the office of Democratic National Committee in an attempt to wiretap the phones and steal documents in the office. The burglars that were attempting the robbery were arrested and found to be connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election committee. Since this was prior to the election, President Nixon, of course, lied to the American citizens and swore that his staff was not involved in the break-in. Most voters believed him, so he was re-elected in 1972. After his re-election, he began to take aggressive steps to cover up his crimes. One, for example, he arranged to provide a payoff to the burglars with hush money. But these cover-ups didn't last long when the conspiracy was revealed by reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. This reveal and constant cover-ups forced President Nixon to resign on August 9, 1974, to avoid impeachment. By the time the scandal was over, 69 people had been charged with crimes, and dozens of companies also pleaded guilty to charges of illegally financing Nixon's re-election campaign. Altogether, it was one of the largest criminal federal cases. So now that you have a better understanding of what the Watergate scandal is, I can further explain Mark Felt's involvement in this case. As mentioned previously, the conspiracy of President Nixon's involvement in the Watergate scandal was revealed by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. These journalists wouldn't have had the resources to reveal the conspiracy if it wasn't for Mark Felt. Mark Felt was the whistleblower in the scandal who provided Woodward and Bernstein with the information needed to unravel the Nixon Watergate scandal, and he did so anonymously, going by the code name Deep Throat. So giving a little background on Felt, he was the FBI assistant director at the time of Nixon's presidency, and it so happened the FBI director John Edgar Hoover passed away. Felt, of course, was expecting to be appointed to the FBI director of the FBI, but Nixon instead appointed Patrick Gray. Felt was angry about this and upset over Nixon's attempt to stall the Burroughs Watergate investigation. At the time, the FBI was battling for its independence against the administration of President Nixon. So, with saying this, Felt obviously had the means and the motive to help uncover the Nixon scandal. Now going on to when Felt began to whistleblow to the Washington Post, he made an agreement with Woodward and Bernstein where he refused to be quoted and agreed only to confirm information obtained. So he wasn't providing straight evidence, but rather telling the journalists they were on the right track. And Felt was also worried about the potential possibilities of their phones being tapped. So he met up with Woodward in the middle of the night to confirm stories linking Nixon's re-election committee to Watergate. Felt was the one who helped bring down Nixon's scandal, and without him, there might not have been a Watergate shorthand to reveal the abuse of presidential powers. Although we would expect that Felt faced some sort of consequences, he faced no consequences since he remained anonymous for 3 decades. He eventually revealed his identity to the public a short 3 years before he died in 2005. And I want to talk a little bit about the whistleblowing aspects of what Mark Felt did. Felt took part in external whistleblowing where he reported the misconduct to an outside source, which was the Washington Post. He took information that he gathered from the FBI and reported it to the outside source. So speaking on this external whistleblowing, I want to conclude with the question of if this whistleblowing was the right move by Felt. I don't know about you guys, but I feel that he could have been doing this out of revenge for not being appointed director of the FBI, rather than the good for the citizens to know about the scandalous situations going on in the White House. But then again, he could have been doing both, doing a good deed with just the extra benefit that he happened to be whistleblowing towards the guy that didn't give him the higher up job. I'll leave the question up to you about whether Felt did the whistleblowing the right way or not. Obviously, it was the right thing to do in the sense that he was informing the American citizens of this scandalous president. But do you believe that he was doing it for those morally correct reasons only? Or was it to get his revenge on President Nixon? Or maybe it was just wrong for him to do this in the sense that it's illegal to report classified government information to the public. With these views, Felt can be seen as a villain in some eyes and a hero in others. In utilitarianist eyes, I believe they would think that it was the right thing to do since it involved the US citizens' right to know that their leaders were being corrupt. I also think that the Kantians would believe that it was Felt's moral duty to report the moral wrongdoing he was witnessing. but maybe it wasn't since it was illegal to report that information. With all that being said, what do you think about whistleblowing moves? Felt's whistleblowing moves.
Karen Silkwood was an employee at Kerr-McGee in the early 1970s. Kerr-McGee produced plutonium pellets for nuclear power. Early in Silkwood's employment at Kerr-McGee, she joined the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. Silkwood was an active member, participating in strikes and eventually joining the bargaining committee. During her time at Kerr-McGee, she would carefully document any potential hazards to the employees or nuclear product consumers that she came across. Silkwood made her concerns clear to both the company and the union. While the union attempted to address these issues with Kerr-McGee as well, they were mostly unsuccessful. In the summer of 1974, Silkwood would end up testifying in front of the AEC, or Atomic Energy Commission, sharing her discoveries and concerns. On November 4th, 1974, Silkwood would find herself contaminated with an incredibly high dosage of radiation. After inspection of the gloves she used to interact with the plutonium, it was discovered they had no ruptures and there was no radiation detected inside of them. The radiation had apparently come from a different source, but there should have been no other point where Karen would be in contact with plutonium or any residual radiation from plutonium. Silkwood would exhibit dangerously high levels of plutonium radiation the next morning as well, despite not being exposed to it since her last work shift. Then, on November 7th, she exhibited her highest level of radiation yet. She was so contaminated that the air she exhaled was registering as radioactive. Her house was inspected and found to be heavily contaminated with radiation. Her possessions were taken and destroyed in order to get rid of this radiation. Soon after this, Silkwood made the decision to share her findings with the public, agreeing to meet with a New York Times journalist and share documentation regarding the contamination and severity of the danger. On November 13th, Silkwood left her house to meet this journalist. However, Silkwood would never end up reaching this meeting. She crashed into a culvert while in transit to the meeting and died. It is suspected that Silkwood was deliberately taken off the road in order to dissuade her from attending the meeting or potentially even kill her. There's no definitive evidence proving this theory. The AEC would ultimately end up investigating Kerr-McGee, and they would discover that Kerr-McGee was negligent in its handling of its plutonium. Kerr-McGee would end up being closed in 1975. Kerr-McGee would later be sued by Silkwood's estate, and Kerr-McGee argued that Silkwood had contaminated herself in order to disparage the company. After a lengthy court battle, the Silkwood estate would end up settling out of court for $1.38 million, with Kerr-McGee admitting no liability. Silkwood's story is one of the first and most notable whistleblower stories of all time. The story demonstrates the lengths that a company would go to protect its bottom line, and it reinforces how important whistleblower protections are. There's no doubt that Silkwood did everything in her power to ensure that the plutonium pellets she worked with met safety standards and that no employees were being needlessly exposed to radiation. Karen's story is unique in the sense that it is overwhelmingly likely that the company attempted to harm, if not kill, Silkwood. It's likely that they planted this contamination in her house or in some of her work equipment in order to deliberately contaminate her. At no point did Kerr-McGee make any attempt to fix their faulty business practices or admit liability. Instead, they took extrajudicial measures in an attempt to prevent Silkwood from speaking out. From a utilitarian perspective, Silkwood was justified in her speaking out. Complicity or negligence would likely only lead to more harm and potential danger for consumers and employees of this plutonium. From a Kantian perspective, Karen acted in such a way that I would like to imagine is universalizable. Silkwood made every effort to inform the company, the union, the AEC, and eventually the media. She acted in the best interest of the public health and acted in such a way that gave Kerr-McGee numerous opportunities to correct these issues.
In most whistleblowing situations, it seems that the public commonly sides with the whistleblower. This seems to root from the idea that the whistleblower is easier to relate to than a corporate company, especially when it's the company's suspicious acts that are being exposed. One great example of this was the Edward Snowden case. I'm sure most of you have heard the story of Edward Snowden, but if you haven't, I'll give you a quick run through of it. Edward Snowden was a consultant employee for the NSA working on monitoring electronic communication in China and North Korea. During his time in Hawaii, Snowden came across information of the NSA monitoring US citizens, which to him seemed not only immoral, but illegal. Upon finding this information, Snowden decided to take action and report this to his supervisor. This led to nothing, as his supervisor just shook it off and told him to leave it be. Following the denial from his supervisor in 2013, Snowden decided to take it into his own hands. Over a span of several weeks, he downloaded classified documents, which he stored on a hard drive and flew to Hong Kong. There he met with representatives from the Washington Post and The Guardian to pass along the information and get it into the spotlight worldwide. Snowden's actions led to the discovery that the NSA was monitoring millions of emails and calls of US citizens. And not only that, it was also discovered that the NSA was spying on allied leaders such as Germany's Angela Merkel, whose phone had been tapped for years. The government immediately went after Snowden, revoking his passport and leaving him stuck in Russia. In 2016, a movie was made to recount this story. It was called Snowden. This film gives a glimpse of what can be assumed to be the public opinion, at least to some extent. Although much of the movie is just reenactments of what was said to happen in dramatized fashion, a slight bias in support of Snowden can be seen throughout the film. Much of his actions in the movie come across as brave, courageous, and heroic. He is in a way depicted as putting his life on the line to defend the nation from having their constitutional rights being taken. And I do think that this was how much of the country had felt about what he did. Diving deeper into the thought process, we wonder why the majority of the public supported Snowden. I think that much of the support was rooted in the fact that every citizen was involved in what Snowden exposed. It was all of our rights and privacies that were being taken away through the NSA's monitoring. It was easy to back Snowden when the opponent was a faceless organization who was monitoring the country against their will. I think the public also didn't bat an eye to support Snowden due to how poorly the NSA went about handling the situation. At first, they denied all accusations and immediately went after Snowden. It wasn't until later on that they admitted that what they had been doing and had been actively monitoring calls and emails. Shady acts such as that don't tend to win over the public. Although I think most people at this point would side with Snowden, there are obviously still some who oppose his actions and believe he was a traitor. Some believe that although it was against our rights to monitor us, in the end it was for our benefit to keep the country safe. Especially with the monitoring of our allied leaders, some argue it gave the United States a hand up in international affairs and was all in support of making our nation better. Others still oppose him simply for the fact that what Snowden did was by law considered illegal. Although what he did may be considered honorable, some still seek that he serves his due time. Oddly enough, even after the admission by the NSA, it is assumed that if Snowden were to ever return, that he'd likely have to face some sort of prison time. Although it'll never be possible to exactly determine how the public perceives Snowden, NPR held a debate and poll that gives us at least a glimpse of where people stand. They said that 54% agreed that the actions Snowden took were the right decision, 35% disagree with what he did, and 11% were undecided. Although it is somewhat split, this data still supports our earlier assumption that the public generally sides with the whistleblower, especially in the case of Snowden.
Well, there you have it. Whistleblowing. Pretty strange, ain't it? How some people can get killed for doing the right thing. And pretty also strange that people kind of ignore the deaths of these people when they're trying to expose ethical wrongdoings. That is strange. You wonder why some people are okay with killing those who are just trying to help, just trying to do something for a good cause. It's kind of odd, kind of like Chris P. Bacon. By the way, what was he exposing the U.S. government for? To be honest with you, I have no idea. We didn't really let him finish. By the way, where did he go? Guys? I think the United States government launched me into space for what I was about to say. That's how important it was. Well, I guess we'll never know. Seems like he may have just run off to go maybe help some other people, maybe do some more good. But I hope we could shed some light on what whistleblowing is, and I hope it graded your understanding because it's a very important thing and it's also a sensitive subject on a lot of people's eyes. Yeah, it really expanded my horizons. I really like that part about Kantianism. Were you really listening or are you just saying that? Well, I gotta run. I think Crispy Bacon's calling my name. Yeah, okay, whatever. Thank you all for watching. I'm glad we could shed some light on whistleblowing. I hope you have a great day, and we hope you'd appreciate our presentation. I want to thank all my group members for doing a great job, and thank you to our sources who provided us the good information.